I sensed something was wrong long before I reached the driveway. It wasn't the weather or the time of day, it was the kind of silence that settles over a place when something sordid has been disturbed. A silence that makes a man's pulse skip even if he can't explain why. My return was supposed to be simple. A quiet homecoming after too many months away, a chance to walk back into the house my mother always promised would be mine someday, a house built on Sunday dinners, repaired fences, and the kind of love that lasts longer than it has any reason to. But all of that vanished the moment I saw the unfamiliar vehicle parked in front. A car that did not belong to this street, a presence that did not belong to my family. I stepped out of my truck, and before I could even shut the door, the front door of the house swung open. My aunt, a woman who hadn't set foot in this home in over a decade, standing in the doorway as if she held the right to decide who entered and who didn't. She didn't offer a greeting, didn't mention my mother. She just looked at me steady cold and said, "You're a little too late." And right then I understood whatever my mother meant for me. Someone else had already taken. The mountains came into view just as the evening light began slipping behind their edges. I had been on the road since morning, letting the miles fold behind me while I held on to one simple thought. I was going home. After 4 months on a job site that felt closer to the moon than Wyoming, I wanted nothing more than to pull into my old neighborhood in Helena and feel the familiar weight of belonging settle into my bones. My mother had passed in March, and even now the truth of it sat strangely on my shoulders like a coat that did not quite fit. The town looked the same when I crossed the last intersection, yet quieter, as if someone had turned the volume down on a life I used to know. I slowed the truck when the pale blue outline of the house appeared at the end of the block. The maple tree still leaned the same way, branches dipping slightly toward the driveway. For a moment I imagined the porch light turning on. Imagined my mother waiting by the window the way she used to whenever I came home late from school. She never scolded me. She only asked if I had eaten, and she would warm something on the stove even when she already knew the answer. I turned into the driveway and the illusion broke clean in half. A black Cadillac Escalade sat in front of the garage, polished heavy, unfamiliar. Its surface caught the last bit of sun and threw it back in a way that made me stop before shifting the truck into park. There was something final about its presence, something deliberate, like someone had replaced a photograph from my childhood with a newer, colder version that had nothing to do with me. I climbed out of the truck. The gravel still cracked the same way under my boots, but the sound felt muted. I walked toward the front door and reached for the old brass key, the one I kept even when life took me far from Helena. My mother always said she wanted me to have a way back, that no matter what happened between job sites and broken marriages, the door to home would still open. I slid the key into the lock. I turned it once, then again. A single dull click answered me. There was no movement, no familiar resistance, just a quiet refusal. I tried once more, slower this time, the way I used to coax the stubborn lock on winter nights when ice made everything stiff. Nothing happened. I stepped back and looked at the door, at the fresh glow of the porch paint, at the way the handle shined as if it had been polished by someone who had taken ownership long before I arrived. A memory rose unexpected and sharp. One wintry evening, my mother had waited for me with a bowl of stew warming on the stove. I had come home later than I meant to, and she never said a word about it. She simply smiled and handed me a spoon as if time forgave all distance. I let that memory stay with me for a moment before the present pulled me back. A voice carried from beside the fence. "Michael, is that you?" I turned and saw Ruth Henderson watching me. Her hands rested on the worn rail as if she needed it to steady herself. She had been our neighbor for as long as I could remember. Her face, usually warm and lively, looked troubled. I walked toward her. She held my gaze for a long second before speaking. "Your aunt changed the locks back in April. She said the house was hers now." The weight of her words settled slowly, landing in places inside me that were already bruised. She added softly that my mother had never mentioned anything about it, that none of this made sense to her. Before I could answer, I heard the front door open behind me. I turned and saw my Aunt Marianne Foster standing in the frame. Her posture was composed, almost formal, and her expression carried no trace of the woman who gave me lemon drops when I fell off my bike as a child. Her eyes moved from me to the truck and back again, cool and unreadable. "You are back," she said, her tone calm, as if my appearance were an inconvenience she had already anticipated. She shifted slightly, giving me a narrow view into the hallway. The walls were bare, my mother's photographs were gone. The air inside looked too bright, too orderly, as if someone had stripped away the life that once filled the house and replaced it with silence. Ruth whispered an apology behind me. I could hear the strain in her voice, but I could not turn a beat from the doorway. Something in the way Marianne stood there holding the frame with one relaxed hand made my jaw tighten. I looked at the window beside the door. My mother used to sit there late in the day with a book and a cup of tea. The glass now was spotless, cleaner than she ever had the strength to keep it in her final years. Someone else had wiped away every trace of her touch. Marianne spoke again. "If you need anything, talk to me." Her voice sounded practiced, almost gentle, but the kind of gentleness that carried its own warning. A warm light flickered on above the porch. It stretched across the steps and glinted off the Escalade, creating a thin line of reflection across the hood. The moment lingered longer than it should have, quiet yet heavy, like the pause before something breaks. I stood there holding the key that no longer worked. It felt small in my hand, lighter than it used to be. I had not only lost my mother, I might have already lost the place she promised would always be mine. And as the porch light glowed behind me, soft and steady, I felt an unease take shape in the fading air. Something had been set in motion long before I returned to Helena. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for me behind that locked door. The quiet around the house thickened as I stood on the porch. The light behind me glowed, steady, gentle, but it did nothing to ease the weight settling in my chest. I stepped back inside. The air carried a scent that did not belong here, something floral and sharp, as if someone had tried to scrub the house of every trace of my mother. I felt the absence before I understood it. A hollow echo in a place that used to breathe warmth. Marianne waited in the hallway with a practiced patience. She told me she had something to show me. Her voice floated through the space in a careful, measured way. I followed her past the empty walls and into the dining room. The table was bare except for a neat stack of papers placed squarely in the center. The wood beneath them was polished to a shine that made it look like new furniture, not the same table where my mother and I once shared late dinners. She lifted the top document with 2 fingers and handed it to me. I felt the weight of the paper before I read a single word. The title, "Quitclaim Deed," rested at the top. I scanned downward and found my mother's name written in a trembling script I did not recognize. The way the L in Linda looped and curled made something twist inside my gut. My mother's handwriting had always been steady, shaped by years of filling out forms at the hospital where she worked, each letter clear and even. What I held in my hand was a ghost wearing her name. The date caught my eye. February 26. She had still been alive then, but so weak the effort of signing anything would have left her breathless. And the witness, Tom Riley, a man who had been living in Arizona since 2012. I knew that as fact because he called every Christmas without fail to ask about my mother and remind me of the time we almost froze our fingers building a bike ramp in his backyard. There was no chance he had walked into this house to witness anything. I looked at the signature again, letting silence fill the moment between us. Marianne watched me with a calm, that felt too smooth the way a surface looks when something important has been hidden beneath it. A soft creak came from down the hall, a door closing, then footsteps slow and controlled. The man I had seen earlier stepped into view. He looked at me, then at Marianne, and offered a nod that carried no welcome. He introduced himself as Richard Boyd in a low voice, though the words felt incomplete, as if he expected me not to ask who he really was or why he was near my mother's bedroom. He passed through the kitchen and disappeared behind the half wall. The sound of a faucet turning on followed a moment later. Running water, a door shutting, small noises, but they stayed in my head longer than they should have. I turned toward the hallway and pictured my mother lying in her room during her final days. The thought of a stranger moving through that space, closing doors, handling things she left behind, made my hands tighten around the edges of the deed. I felt a tightening in my throat, the kind that comes before words you are not ready to speak. I asked where my mother's documents were kept, her will, her personal notes, anything with her own handwriting. Marianne said everything had been sorted. She said the house was undergoing necessary organization. Her tone was gentle in a way that did not match her eyes. From behind me, Ruth's voice drifted through the open door. She had stepped inside, silent and hesitant, the way people do when witnessing something they wish they were wrong about. She told me she had heard my mother crying weeks before her death. She had heard her say she did not want to sign anything, that she wanted someone to call me. Then she watched Marianne pull the curtains shut. The room changed after that. It felt smaller, as if the walls had leaned inward. I stared down at the deed again. Someone had forged my mother's name. Someone had chosen a date when she barely had the strength to sit up. Someone had reached across state lines to use a witness who could not possibly have stood in that room. Details like these do not happen by accident. They are arranged, managed, executed by hands that know exactly what they are doing. I asked Marianne why she never contacted me during any of this. My voice was steady but heavy. She answered with another careful smile. She said my mother made her intentions clear. She told me I was too busy, that I had my own life, that she was only respecting what my mother wanted. The words settled wrong, every part of them. I let the deed rest on the table. My palm still felt the imprint of the paper even after I released it. I stepped away and moved toward the hallway where Richard had been standing earlier. The floorboards creaked under my weight. The house felt different underfoot, as if it were resisting me, holding its breath. A faint sound came from behind the bedroom door. Too soft for footsteps, too brief to understand. A shift of fabric, or a drawer closing, or a person stepping backward into a shadow. It stopped as soon as I noticed it, leaving an echo of suspicion hanging in the dim air. I stood there for a moment with my hand near the doorknob. Marianne's voice cut through the quiet. She said that room was being sorted and I should leave things be for now. Her words nudged me back toward the dining room. The county stamp on the deed stared up at me from the table. April 8, 10 days after the funeral. Just long enough for paperwork to move quietly through the clerk's office without raising questions. The timing felt too precise to be coincidence. I stepped outside to breathe. The porch light shone behind me, casting a long shape across the driveway. The Escalade gleamed under the fading sky, its surface reflecting the house that suddenly felt foreign. The air smelled like pine and early summer, but beneath that I sensed something else. A trace of new paint, a faint detergent, evidence that someone had been altering things piece by piece. I looked down at the deed still in my hand. The ink along the signature caught the porch light and held it for a moment. I noticed a small dot of ink near the edge of the page, a darker mark that had not fully dried before the document was stacked. Someone had handled it recently. Someone had been preparing for my arrival. Every detail pointed toward the same truth. My absence had been an opportunity. My mother had been vulnerable, and the people who should have protected her had chosen to remake her final months in a way that served them. I stayed there under the porch light until the wind shifted and carried the scent of the neighborhood I once belonged to. It washed over me, familiar yet distant, a reminder of a life that was slipping through my fingers faster than I could grasp it. The house stood behind me, quiet and still, but something inside it was moving. Something hidden in the shadows of rooms I used to know by heart, waiting for the next step I would take. Morning light drifted across the street as I stood beside my truck, letting the cool air settle over me. I had been outside longer than I realized. The house behind me stayed silent, its windows reflecting nothing of the life that once lived there. I opened the truck door and sat inside for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until the tension in my hands eased. I knew where I needed to go. There was only one person in Helena who could tell me what my mother intended in her final months. The drive to Harris and Whitmore Law carried me through familiar roads lined with offices and small shops, each one waking into a new day. I parked beside the old brick building that housed William Harris's practice. The paint on the awning above his door had faded to a soft gray, but the brass letters still shone. I took a breath and stepped inside. The reception area smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. The quiet had a weight to it, the kind that comes from decades of conversations held behind closed doors. The receptionist nodded when she saw me and told me Harris was in. She spoke gently, as if she already knew why I had come. I walked down the narrow hall. Harris's door was cracked open and he looked up from his desk when I stepped in. His face softened, lined with recognition and something like concern. He stood slowly and shook my hand, holding it longer than necessary, the way people do when they want to offer comfort without speaking it aloud. He asked how I was holding up. The words were simple, but his eyes searched mine carefully, waiting for an answer I could not give. I told him I needed to talk about my mother's estate. A small pause followed and he motioned for me to sit. He settled into his chair, fingers folding together, elbows resting on the arms. He asked what brought me in, and I placed the copied deed on his desk. He leaned forward slightly. The farther his eyes moved down the page, the more his expression changed. When he looked up again, there was disbelief, then something sharper. He said he had never heard my mother mention transferring the house to Marianne. He tapped the signature lightly and shook his head. It did not resemble anything he had seen in all the years he represented her. He opened a drawer on his right one, secured by a small silver lock, and took out a thin folder with my mother's name handwritten on the tab. He slid a document toward me. He told me this was the draft will from last year. It carried my mother's signature near the bottom, steady and familiar. 2 witnesses had signed as well. Ruth Henderson and a retired teacher who lived down the hill. The only thing missing was the notarized affidavit that would have formalized it. He said the will itself remained valid even without the extra page. I traced the signature with my eyes. This was the handwriting I knew, the loops firm and balanced, the way she crossed her T's with a gentle downward stroke. It sat on the paper like a steady breath. Nothing like the trembled imitation on Marianne's deed. He reached into the drawer again and pulled out another set of documents, these older and wrinkled at the edges. He explained that several months before she passed, Marianne had brought Linda into his office asking to sign a power of attorney. He had refused to notarize it. He said my mother seemed disoriented, unsure of what she was being asked to sign, and that something felt off in a way that did not sit right with him. He leaned back and opened a file on his computer, scrolling until he found her bank statements. He turned the screen gently toward me. The withdrawals had begun almost 8 months before she died. Small amounts at first, then increasingly large. $187,000 gone over a span of months. The signatures beside them grew uneven and fragmented. He sat quietly for a moment before speaking again. He told me this pattern matched cases he had seen before. Elder financial exploitation. His voice dipped when he said the words, giving them the weight they deserved. He said it was a felony in the state of Montana and not taken lightly by courts or investigators. I stared at the screen, letting each number sink into the spaces inside me that still held memories of my mother budgeting every grocery bill. She saved receipts in small envelopes, wrote notes on the flap about how to stretch meals through the week. She lived carefully, honestly, always thinking ahead. Seeing her account drained that way felt like watching someone erase the last pieces of her life, one line at a time. I asked Harris how something like this could happen without anyone notifying me. He shook his head slowly. He said isolation often plays a part, that people exploit loneliness and declining health. He told me that whoever orchestrated this had taken steps to keep me out of reach. His tone stayed calm, but the message was clear. Someone had engineered the silence between my mother and me. I leaned back in the chair, letting my eyes drift toward the window. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting narrow stripes across the carpet. Dust floated in the beams, moving lazily as if the world outside had slowed to match the heaviness in my chest. I had always believed I would have time to come home, time to fix what distance had broken, time to be the son she deserved. Now the truth was laid out on a desk between us. I asked if there was anything else he had seen or sensed in her last year. He nodded. He told me my mother seemed nervous when he last spoke with her. He said she asked whether I was doing well, though he sensed she had wanted to ask something more, something she stopped herself from saying. He had chalked it up to age and declining health. Now he wondered if she had been afraid to speak in front of the person accompanying her. He placed the folder back into his drawer with care, as if handling something fragile. The sound of the lock clicking shut seemed louder than it should have been. I stood slowly. My legs felt stiff, as though they were adjusting to a truth my mind had only begun to absorb. Harris rose with me and said I could reach out any time. He offered a reassuring nod, one that held both sympathy and conviction. He had seen cases like this before. He knew what the next steps would demand. When I stepped out of his office, the sun felt harsher than when I arrived. The street outside bustled with people heading to work, their movements quick and certain, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside that building. I walked toward my truck, my hand brushing lightly along the metal door before I opened it. Inside the cab, the air carried the faint smell of dust and engine oil. I rested my head against the seat for a moment. The landscape of my life had changed in the span of a single morning. What began as confusion had grown into something larger, darker, more deliberate. This was no longer a question of property or paperwork. It reached deeper, touching the last months of my mother's life. The fear she must have felt, the sense she endured. I felt my breath steady as I realized what lay ahead. Someone had exploited her trust. Someone had used her weakness to take what was not theirs. And they had done it while I was states away, unaware that her world was shrinking around her. I turned the key in the ignition. The truck rumbled beneath me, familiar and grounding. As I pulled onto the road, I felt the weight of a new resolve settle into place, quiet but certain. The fight had shifted. It was no longer about reclaiming a house or a piece of land. It was about uncovering the truth my mother never had the chance to speak. Ahead of me, the road stretched toward Helena's downtown, the light glinting off storefront windows. Somewhere in that city lay the next piece of what happened to her, waiting in the silence between what I knew and what I needed to learn. I drove forward, letting the engine carry me into that silence. The engine hummed beneath me as I drove toward Helena Regional Medical Center, the late morning sun slipping through the windshield in thin streaks. Traffic moved slowly along the main road, but I barely noticed it. The conversation with Harris still played in the back of my mind, each detail settling deeper the farther I drove. My hands rested on the steering wheel in a steady grip. I felt the weight of everything I had learned pressing inward, gathering in the quiet between my breaths. The hospital came into view, its glass entrance catching the light in sharp flashes. I parked near the far end of the lot where fewer cars stood. The asphalt radiated a faint heat as I stepped out. A breeze carried the smell of antiseptic from the open sliding doors. I walked toward the entrance with a heaviness I could not shake, each step echoing the truth that I was about to hear something my mother never meant to be her last message. Inside, the lobby buzzed with low voices and the steady rhythm of footsteps on polished floors. A nurse at the reception desk directed me to the break room near the east wing. She said Tom Delgado was expecting me. I thanked her and made my way down a long hallway lined with muted photographs of Montana landscapes. The smell of coffee drifted faintly from somewhere around the corner. I found Tom standing near a small table pouring himself a cup from a half-empty pot. He looked up when I stepped into the room. His face held a warmth that softened the lines around his eyes. He set the cup down and wiped his palms on his scrubs, then walked toward me with a quiet steadiness. He said he was sorry for my loss. His voice carried a sincerity that felt grounded in something deeper than politeness. He motioned for me to sit at the small table by the window. Outside, the mountains rose behind the parking lot, muted in the mid-morning haze. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. He turned it over in his hand for a moment, as if weighing the consequences of giving it to me. His eyes lifted to meet mine, and he inhaled slowly before speaking. He told me there was an audio file from the night of March 2nd. He said he had recorded it because something felt wrong. He had seen elder coercion before, enough to recognize the signs even when the staff around him could not. He set the flash drive gently on the table between us. I picked it up. My fingers closed around the cool metal and a faint tremor moved through my hand. I plugged it into my phone and pressed play. The room faded as the sound filled my ears. At first, there was the rustle of sheets and the hum of a machine. Then Marianne's voice, sharper than I remembered, hard enough to cut through the static. "Just sign and everything will be over." Her tone held no compassion, only pressure, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed she would not be questioned. Then my mother's voice, weak and trembling, a sound I had never heard from her in life. "I want Michael. Let me speak to my son." The words wavered as if pulled from the last strength she had. The plea echoed in my chest long after it passed through the phone. I stared at the table, my jaw tightening. My breath caught somewhere between anger and something deeper. Tom watched me carefully. He explained that Marianne had presented a power of attorney that night. He told the staff she was the sole contact for all decisions. She told them I was unreachable and uninterested, a phrase that settled in my stomach like a cold stone. He said he challenged her, but without proof he could not override the document she carried. He leaned back slightly, his hands clasped together. He said my mother repeated over and over that she needed to tell me something important the next morning. He paused there, allowing the weight of the words to settle. Tomorrow morning never came. I let the silence expand as the recording played again in my mind. Her voice strained yet determined, reaching for someone who never arrived because someone ensured that I would not be contacted. I felt a slow pressure build behind my ribs, not the sharp pain of shock anymore, but something heavier. Something old and familiar that had been waiting beneath the surface. I asked Tom how my mother looked that night. He hesitated before answering. He said she was frightened. Not because of the illness. because of something she could not say out loud. He had seen it in her eyes, a fear of being silenced, a fear of consequences if she refused to sign. He told me he recorded it against protocol because he believed she was being isolated. He wanted to have something in case her condition worsened. He looked down at his hands as he said it, as if wrestling with the memory of that night. I thanked him quietly. The words felt too small for what he had given me, but they were all I had in that moment. He nodded, understanding more than I could say. I stood and walked toward the window. The mountains stretched across the horizon, steady and unmoving, a contrast to the storm rising inside me. I pressed my palm lightly against the glass and drew a slow breath. The realization settled with an awful clarity. My absence had not been a matter of distance or oversight. It had been engineered. Someone had placed walls between us, one signature at a time, until my mother had no one left to call but the person taking everything from her. Behind me, Tom rose from his chair. His steps were quiet as he approached. "If you ever need anything else," he said gently, "I will help however I can." I turned and nodded. His sincerity steadied me in a way I had not expected. I walked out of the break room with the flash drive still in my hand. The hallway felt longer this time. Nurses moved past, carrying charts, their footsteps echoing lightly off the linoleum floor. A wheelchair rolled softly down the corridor. Life continued around me with its usual rhythm, indifferent to the ache pressing through my chest. As I stepped outside, the sun hit my face warm and bright. Yet it did nothing to chase the cold that had settled along my spine. I paused at the edge of the parking lot and closed my eyes. My mother had reached for me in her Voulauer Simpas. She had called out into a room where no one answered her request. She had tried to speak, to warn me, to leave me with something I needed to know, and I had never heard her. The breeze lifted slightly across the lot. I opened my eyes and looked toward the mountains again. The recording had ended, but the echo of her voice stayed with me, soft and trembling, carrying a message she never had the chance to finish. I stood there for a moment longer, the flash drive warm in my hand, and let the silence wrap around me. It felt like a pause before something I could not yet see, a stillness filled with the truth I was only beginning to uncover. The drive back to the house felt longer than it should have. Afternoon light stretched across the road in long pale leaves, and every mile carried the echo of my mother's voice from the recording. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun had slipped low enough to cast the house in a soot gold. It looked gentler than it had that morning, almost as if it were waiting for me to step inside and face whatever truth it still held. I pushed open the front door without turning on the lights. The quiet settled around me, heavy and familiar, the kind that comes from years of memories sealed in walls that no longer speak. I walked down the hallway toward my mother's bedroom. The door gave a small creak when I opened it, the kind of sound that used to wake me as a boy when she checked on me at night. The air in the room carried a faint scent of lavender, the same fragrance she always used on her pillows. Everything looked as she left it, the quilt folded neatly, a glass of water half full on the nightstand, a book left open beside it, a page marked with a dried leaf she must have picked up from the yard. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me. I sat on the edge of her bed and let my hand rest on the blanket. The fabric felt cool, untouched for months, yet I could still imagine the warmth that once lived here. My eyes drifted to the old dresser against the wall. Something inside me nudged forward, a quiet pull toward whatever she might have left behind. I opened the top drawer and found a small leather journal tucked beneath folded scarves. Its cover was worn at the corners, the color faded to a soft brown. I lifted it carefully and sat back down, letting the weight of it settle in my hands. When I opened it, the first few pages carried her steady handwriting, Notes about the weather, small reminders to buy groceries, questions she wanted to ask me when I came home. Further in the script began to shake. The letters wavered, drifting unevenly across the page as if written by someone afraid of being overheard. I read her words slowly, letting each one press against me with its full weight. She wrote that Marianne told her I no longer cared about the house, that I had started a new life and wanted nothing to do with the past. She wrote that she tried to reach me but was told I was busy. The sentences broke apart near the bottom of the page. Ink smudges trailed off as though her hand trembled too much to finish the thought. I turned the page and found the next one torn out entirely. A thin outline of ink stained the edges where the page had once been. Someone had removed whatever she wanted me to see. Someone had taken her last attempt to speak for herself. I stared at the empty space for a long moment. It felt like standing in a doorway where a voice had just faded, leaving behind a silence that was not peaceful but deliberate. I closed the journal and ran my thumb along the stitching on the cover. Something felt uneven beneath the lining of the back flap. I pressed gently and felt a thin piece of paper hidden inside. I opened the flap carefully and pulled out a small photograph. It was a picture of my father, Samuel Harrington, taken sometime before he left in '95. He stood beside our old pickup, younger than I had ever seen him, a faint smile on his face that looked almost shy. My mother had never spoken of him after he disappeared. Not once. Yet she kept this picture close hidden where no one else would find it. I held the photo between my fingers. The edges were soft from age. The image itself had faded to a gentle sepia tone. I felt a slow tightening in my chest, not sharp, but deep and familiar, like a bruise pressed after years of healing crooked. I remembered the nights she sat at the kitchen table when she thought I was asleep, staring at the empty chair across from her. I remembered the way she walked through the house with quiet steps after he left, careful not to disturb a silence she never asked for. And now I saw the truth in her journal. My own years away on job sites, the calls I meant to make but postponed, the holidays I spent working because it felt easier than facing what distance had built between us. All of it had created the same silence she once survived, and someone else had stepped in to twist it into something darker. I traced my father's face with my thumb, feeling the unfamiliarity of a man I barely knew. I never imagined I would see him again yet. Here he was in my hands, stirring memories I had buried. I wondered what drove him to leave, what he carried with him when he walked out that door all those years ago. And I wondered when I became more like him than I ever intended. The light in the room shifted as the sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the hardwood floor, reaching toward the dresser and the bed. The house seemed to settle deeper into itself. I set the photo beside the journal and leaned back slightly, letting my eyes move across the room. My mother's life had narrowed to these small details in her final days. A journal no one was meant to find, a photo she kept hidden, thoughts she could not voice. The quiet pressed inward again, but this time it felt different. Heavier, more personal. It was the silence between fathers and sons, the kind passed down without intention, shaped by absences large and small. Standing there, I felt its weight settle on me. I saw how easily distance becomes inheritance, how silence becomes a language of its own. I took the photo and the journal and held them against my chest. Outside, a car passed along the street, the sound fading as quickly as it came. The room dimmed until only a soft line of gold remained along the windowsill. I stayed there, letting the stillness wrap around me, neither comforting nor cruel, just real. A pause before something waiting in the shadows of the past would come forward to meet me. Morning came in quiet layers. Light slipped through the blinds in my old bedroom and cut across the floor in pale bands. I had not slept much. The journal and my father's photograph lay on the nightstand. I picked them up before leaving the house, slid them into the inside pocket of my jacket, and stepped out into the cool air. The sky over Helena County Courthouse was a washed-out blue when I pulled into the lot. The building rose in front of me, brick and stone slid in the way only old government buildings know how to be. Men in work boots and women in business clothes moved up the steps with that familiar courthouse pace, slow but purposeful. I sat in the truck for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the dull thud of car doors closing around me. Inside, the hallways smelled of floor polish and burned coffee. Voices bounced off high ceilings in soft echoes. I found the courtroom listed on the monitor and followed the signs down a long corridor. When I pushed through the heavy door, the room greeted me with a hush. Wooden benches, tall windows, the state seal hanging above the judge's bench. Harris was already there, seated at the table to the left. He gave a small nod when he saw me. His expression calm but alert. I took a seat beside him. Across the aisle, Marianne sat with her attorney. She wore a dark blazer and a silver necklace I had never seen before. Her hands were folded neatly on the table, fingers still face composed. Richard sat behind her on the bench, shoulders hunched, eyes restless as they moved over the room. The judge entered and everyone rose. We sat when instructed. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm that matched the muffled footsteps and shuffling papers around us. This was just the beginning, Harris had told me. A preliminary hearing, a simple step in a longer process. It did not feel simple. The judge asked for opening statements. Marianne's attorney stood, buttoned his coat, and addressed the court. He spoke of a newly discovered will my aunt had found among my mother's belongings. He described it as a more recent expression of my mother's wishes. His words were smooth practiced. He moved his hands just enough to emphasize the phrases he wanted to land. He said the will named Marianne as the primary beneficiary of the estate. He said my mother wanted to ensure the house and assets would be managed by someone who had been physically present during her later years. Every sentence tightened the muscles along my jaw a bit more. Harris rose when it was his turn. He spoke less, but each word landed with more weight. He said there was a properly executed draft will from the year before leaving the house and land to me. He mentioned his long history with my mother as her attorney. He did not embellish. He let the facts speak for themselves, as if he believed truth needed no extra polish. The judge asked to see the new will. Marianne's attorney approached the bench with a folder. The document was handed to the judge, then passed down to us. Harris placed it between us on the table. I leaned closer. My mother's name sat near the bottom of the page, written in that same shaky imitation I had seen on the deed. Above it, the text spelled out a clear message: all property to be left to Marianne Foster. My name appeared only once as a reference point, not as a recipient. My eyes moved to the line marked witnesses. 2 names. The first belonged to a neighbor I barely recognized. The second stopped my breath short: Samuel Harrington. For a moment the letters blurred. The room seemed to tilt just slightly, though I knew it was not moving. My father's name printed clearly on a legal document beneath a signature that looked like his hand. Or at least the memory of it. A man missing from my life for 30 years suddenly pulled into the center of my mother's death. Harris glanced at me. His expression tightened. He had not known this detail until now either. The judge studied the document, then lifted his gaze. "Mr. Harris," he said, "do you dispute the authenticity of the signatures?" Harris spoke evenly. He said we had serious concerns regarding both my mother's signature and that of the witness. He requested handwriting analysis and independent verification of the witness identity. His tone did not rise, but the current beneath it was firm. The judge nodded and agreed to an expedited examination. He ordered copies of the will to be sent to a forensic document examiner and instructed the clerk to confirm the identity and status of the witness named as Samuel Harrington. Then Harris asked for permission to present additional evidence. The judge granted it with a brief motion of his hand. Tom sat on the bench behind us. Harris called him forward. The nurse walked to the front with a cautious calm. He took the stand, raised his hand when asked, and swore to tell the truth. His voice was steady as he recounted the events of March 2nd. He explained how Mary Ann came to the hospital with a power of attorney, how she insisted the staff speak only to her, how my mother repeatedly asked to talk to me and was denied. Then Harris asked the judge if he could play an audio recording. The judge agreed. The courtroom quieted further as if even the walls leaned in. The sound came through the speakers with a faint hiss at first. Then Mary Ann's voice, pressing, impatient, telling my mother to sign so that everything would be over. There was no care in it, only force. My mother's reply followed, weak, trembling, asking to speak to me, saying my name with a kind of urgency I had never heard from her. The words filled the room. For a brief moment it felt like she was there. Her fear and longing laid bare in front of strangers in dark suits and quiet shoes. I watched the judge as he listened. His eyes remained on the table, but his jaw worked slightly. A few people on the benches shifted, uncomfortable with the intimacy of what they were hearing. Mary Ann sat very still, her face as composed as she could manage, though I noticed a small tightening around her mouth. When the audio ended, the silence that followed was louder than any reaction. Harris let it hang for a moment before asking Tom a final question. Did he believe my mother was being pressured that night? Tom answered yes, without hesitation. The judge made a few notes, then looked first to Mary Ann's attorney, then to Harris. He spoke in a measured tone. He said the recording and the financial pattern raised serious concerns about undue influence and coercion. He repeated his order for a thorough examination of the will and confirmed that no transfer of property would be recognized until the investigation was complete. The hearing adjourned soon after. People stood, chairs scraped against the floor, voices rose in low murmurs. I remained seated for an extra moment, watching the front of the courtroom, listening to the fading echo of my mother's voice in my mind. When I stepped outside, the air felt cooler. Clouds had moved in, dulling the sun. Harris walked with me down the steps. He rested a hand on my shoulder and told me we had taken an important step. There was still a long way to go, but the truth had begun to surface. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. My phone vibrated in my pocket as I reached the truck. An unknown number from Montana State Police flashed on the screen. I answered and leaned against the side of the truck, the metal cool through my jacket. The officer on the other end spoke in a calm, professional tone. He said they had begun verifying the witness listed on the will. He said the name Samuel Harrington had led them to records in northern Idaho. They had located a man living there under another name, a man whose fingerprints matched old employment files from Montana. The man was alive. He had agreed to speak to law enforcement. He was willing to meet me if I wished. I did not respond at first. I heard my own breath moving in and out, slow and shallow. The officer asked if I was still on the line. I said yes. My voice sounded distant even to me. After he hung up, I stayed where I was, hands still holding the phone, the screen gone dark. Cars passed along the street in lazy midday traffic, their engines a dull backdrop to the rush of blood in my ears. My father was not a memory. He was out there living under a different name, signing papers that now sat at the center of my mother's death. The wound he left when he walked out of our lives 3 decades ago opened again, raw and unanswered, now tied to everything that had happened in this house, in this town, in these last months. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and lifted my eyes toward the courthouse steps. People moved in and out, carrying their own quiet battles. Mine had just shifted into something larger than I had prepared for. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past my face, tugging at the edges of my jacket. I drew a slow breath and let it out. The parking lot around me hummed with ordinary life, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. What began as a fight over a house now stretched back across 30 years of silence. Past and present had threaded themselves together, and there was no way to pull them apart without facing what had been left undone. I opened the truck door and sat behind the wheel. For a moment I did not start the engine. I simply rested my hands where they had been so many times before and let the weight of what waited ahead settle into the space between my ribs, quiet and firm like a door that had just unlocked somewhere deep inside a life I thought I understood. The road into northern Idaho opened in long stretches of muted fields, the kind that make you feel every year you have been away from something you should have faced earlier. I drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting loosely on my thigh, letting the steady rumble of the engine settle my nerves. The sky hung low, brushed with thin clouds that made the morning light look tired. By the time I reached the small town, the officer mentioned the sun had climbed enough to cast sharp shadows across the diner parking lot. The place sat at the edge of the highway, a single-story building with a faded red roof and windows smudged by years of dust. A semi idled nearby, filling the air with the smell of diesel and worn rubber. I stepped out of the truck and drew a slow breath. The scent of burnt coffee drifted from the open door, followed by the clatter of dishes and the quiet hum of conversation. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through blinds that had not been cleaned in a while. Booths lined the walls, their vinyl cracked and patched. A waitress in a blue apron moved from table to table with practiced ease. At the far end, near the window, sat the man I had come to see. He was smaller than the silhouette I carried in my memory. His shoulders curved forward as if time had pushed them down little by little. Lines creased his face, not sharply but softly, as if regret had been carving at him for years. His hair was gray and thin. His hands rested around a ceramic mug, holding it gently the way a person holds warmth they do not trust to stay. For a moment I stood at the entrance without moving. He lifted his eyes, and when they found mine, something flickered there. Recognition, guilt, hope. Then he lowered his gaze again, almost as if he feared he had imagined me. I walked to the booth and stopped beside it. He rose slowly, unsure of how close he should stand. His voice caught on my name when he spoke it. Michael. The word hovered in the air, fragile and unfinished. I nodded and slid into the booth. He followed, sitting across from me with a stiffness that had little to do with age. The waitress arrived and poured coffee into my mug with a quiet smile. When she walked away, the silence settled again, heavy but not empty. My father traced a finger along the rim of his cup, smoothing the same spot over and over. I watched him for a moment, letting the quiet stretch, letting him feel the weight of those 30 years. He cleared his throat. His voice sounded older than his face, worn by memories I had never heard. He said Marianne found him months earlier. She told him my mother wanted to simplify paperwork, that the old documents were confusing her. She said he could help by signing as a witness. He said he thought he was doing the right thing, that he believed he was easing a burden my mother had been carrying. I asked if he spoke to her, if he saw her. He stared at the table and shook his head. No, he said softly. I trusted what I was told. He let the words sit between us. His hands tightened on the cup and then loosened. When I asked why he left in '95, he leaned back slightly, as if bracing himself against the memory. He said he had fallen into debt with men who did not let go. He said he feared they would come to the house, that they would use us to force his hand. He thought disappearing would shield us. He thought distance was protection. He looked up, and for the first time since I arrived, he held my gaze without turning away. His eyes were tired, but beneath them was something familiar, something I had not seen since I was a boy, a softness, a worry, a man who had believed he had no other choice. I felt anger rise in me slow and steady, not the kind that burns fast, but the kind that sinks deep and stays. I felt sadness too for the years he lost, for the years I lost, for the way silence had shaped both our lives. And somewhere behind all of it, a thin thread of sympathy pulled at me, unwelcome but honest. I told him what happened in the hospital. I told him about the recording, about my mother calling for me, about the fear in her voice. I told him how Marianne isolated her, how she drained her accounts, how she manipulated the silence between us. As I spoke, his face tightened, the muscles along his jaw clenching with each detail. He looked away for a moment toward the window where trucks rolled past in slow intervals. His reflection lay faint against the glass, smaller, dimmer, as if he barely recognized himself. He asked if she had suffered. The question came out quiet, meant more for himself than for me. "She needed us," I said. He nodded, his throat working as he swallowed. Then he placed both hands on the table, palms flat, and took a breath that trembled just slightly. He asked if there was anything he could do now. He asked if he could help fix what he had helped break. I told him the truth. I told him he could testify, that he could tell the court how Marianne approached him, what she said, what she hid, that it might mean facing perjury charges, that it would expose the life he had built under another name. He listened without flinching. When I finished, he lifted his eyes again, and this time there was something like resolve in them. He said he was willing, that he was done hiding, that he owed my mother more than excuses and me more than silence. For a while we sat without speaking. The silence was different now, not heavy with the weight of years, but full of something shifting, something uncertain but real. The kind of silence that exists when two men are not ready to forgive, but are ready to at least face the truth. He reached into his jacket, then slowly, almost hesitantly. He pulled out a thin wallet and opened it with careful hands. From inside he drew the small, worn photograph. He placed it on the table and slid it toward me. It was a picture of me at 12, standing in front of our old house holding a new baseball glove. He said he kept it with him all these years, even when he changed his name, even when he moved from town to town. He said it reminded him of what he had lost and what he hoped he could someday fix. I looked at the photo for a long moment, my breath catching on something I did not want to call emotion. I nodded once, the movement slow but steady. When it was time to leave, he stood first. I followed, and we met at the end of the booth. For a second he hesitated, then he extended his hand. I took it. His grip was firm, warm, uncertain, honest. It was not forgiveness. It was a beginning. I turned and walked toward the door. The bell above it chimed softly when I pushed it open. Outside, the afternoon light stretched across the lot. A truck rumbled past, its engine vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The air smelled of diesel and sunlight warming old asphalt. I paused beside my truck and looked back through the diner window. He was still standing in the booth, his hand resting where the photograph had been. Then the reflection of the sun swallowed the view, leaving only the sound of engines and the long road leading back to Montana. I opened the door and let the quiet settle around me, knowing for the first time in months that I was no longer walking into the fight alone. The afternoon light drifted across the windshield as I pulled out of the diner lot, a soft gold that settled over the highway in long, quiet strokes. The road stretched open in front of me, familiar yet changed, as if the land itself understood something had shifted inside me. I drove without turning on the radio, letting the hum of the engine and the dull whisper of the tires carry me back toward Helena. With every mile, the weight in my chest settled deeper, not as a burden, but as something finally allowed to rest. By the time I reached the courthouse, the sun had lifted high enough to warm the stone steps and cast a pale shimmer over the windows. People gathered in slow clusters outside, speaking in low voices, their footsteps echoing in the wide hallway beyond the doors. When I stepped inside, the cool air met me with the faint scent of paper and varnished wood. Harris joined me by the benches, adjusting his glasses with a quiet nod. My father sat a short distance away. His hands folded together, his posture still and composed in a way that suggested he was holding himself steady from the inside out. The hearing began with the soft scrape of chairs and the measured tone of the clerk. Documents were presented one by one, each examined in the even voice of the judge. The forged deed was dismantled with calm precision. The witness signatures were reviewed by experts who pointed out the hesitations in the lines and the mismatched pressure on the strokes. When Samuel's name appeared in the projected documents, there was a slight shift in the room, a faint tightening of silence around him, but he did not look away. Then the recording played. Tom's voice entered first, steady, then my mother's voice followed, trembling and thin. The sound filled the courtroom in a slow wave that seemed to press into every corner. Marianne stiffened when her own words came through her shoulders, rising just slightly. Richard sank deeper into his seat, his hands curling over his knees. Even the judge's expression softened at the edges, not with sympathy, but with the sober recognition of something unmistakably real. When the recording ended, the quiet that followed was heavy enough to feel like a physical thing. The judge took a breath and delivered the decision with firm clarity. Every fraudulent document was void. The house and accounts were restored to me. The money taken from my mother was to be repaid. The district attorney would move forward with charges of forgery, financial exploitation, and coercion. I listened without raising my head, feeling the words settle the way dust settles after a long storm. When the room emptied, I remained seated for a moment. My father walked past slowly and paused at the aisle. He did not speak. He only gave a small nod, one that held more weight than anything he might have said. I returned the gesture and rose to leave. Outside, the afternoon air carried the faint scent of pine drifting in from the hills. A soft breeze moved along the street, brushing past the flagpole and stirring the edges of my jacket. I walked to the truck with steady steps and sat behind the wheel, letting the warmth from the sun soak into my arms before I started the engine. The drive home felt quiet in a different way than before. The houses passed by with their porches and mailboxes and trimmed lawns, the normalcy of it settling into me like a reminder that life continues in simple forms even while yours feels paused. When I reached the driveway, the house greeted me without sound, standing in the afternoon light like a place waiting patiently for someone to come back. Inside, the air felt warm and mellow. Dust floated in thin streaks through a beam of light near the staircase. I walked up to the attic, the sound of my steps muted by the old wood beneath them. The attic held the faint smell of aged cardboard and cedar. A single narrow window allowed a strip of sunlight to fall across the floor. I approached the steel box tucked beneath a folded quilt and opened it carefully. The deed to the 40 acres lay inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, the ink of my mother's signature steady and strong. Holding it, I felt a quiet pulse of recognition, as if something she hoped for me had finally reached its rightful place. Later in the garage, I found the old Harrington and Son construction sign leaning against the wall. The wood was worn smooth where she had polished it year after year. I lifted it and hung it above the workbench. When I stepped back, the late afternoon sun caught the edges of the faded lettering, giving it a soft glow that lingered before fading as a cloud drifted past the window. When evening settled in, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar yet deliberate. I opened it slowly. The message was short, only a few words, but they carried the weight of decades my father had spent away. I am done running. I traced the shape of the letters with my thumb, noticing the slight tremor at the edges. The way a man might write when he wants something to be steady but cannot quite control his hand. I placed the letter on the table and let it rest there beside the faint light from a nearby lamp. As night deepened, I sat in the living room and pressed play on the recording again. My mother's voice rose softly, fragile, yet filled with a strength I had not heard in years. "Michael, you can do this." The sound seemed to move through the room like a warm wind brushing through memories I had tried so long to outrun. When the recording ended, the house settled into silence. The lamplight cast a soft amber glow across the floor. I stood, let my hand rest on the doorframe, and drew a steady breath. "Mom, I am home now," I said into the quiet, "and this time I am staying." The words drifted into the stillness, carried gently by the warm air, and something inside me eased with them. A breeze slipped through the slightly open window behind the couch, stirring the curtains just enough to let in the faint scent of nightgrass. The house seemed to breathe with me, calm and unhurried, as the last of the light faded and the quiet took its rightful place.